if you were at Elevate, you've experienced this platform before. It's very different from Zoom. If this is your first time, you're like, what is this, getting your bearings? It's pretty cool. So we have, if you are interested in asking questions, because it is a live Q&A, there's a Q&A area. I guess point this way, reverse, but check it out and feel free to ask your questions now. And with that, I will say hello to Alan and Monica. Alan, Monica, hello.
Hello there. Hi, David.
Good to have you and welcome, and excited to dive right in. So why don't we start, if you don't mind, each of you sharing just like a brief background of yourself and kind of what you'd like to kind of initially mention as it relates to burnout. Maybe for you, what the definition of burnout is for you. I know that for me right now, I've been experiencing a little bit in the last couple of days where working on an engineering problem, you get distracted by something and you don't make progress on the thing you wanted to, and then that happens like over and over and over again, and then you just don't have any energy to work on that original problem. That's kind of like where my head is at right now. But Monica, why don't we start with you? Feel free to share your brief background and your definition of burnout. And then meanwhile, folks, feel free to put in Q&A as they talk.
Sure. Thank you, David. Really excited to be here today. And thank you. I'm looking forward for more engaging conversations throughout the workshop today. So my background, I'm currently a senior engineering director, managing product and engineering at Workday. And one of my prime roles is to build the Workday community, which is very powerful. So I always feel like bringing engineering back to the customers closer together is super critical. My background has been across different industries. I worked at Ultimate Software prior to coming to Workday. They are also in the human capital management space. And before that, I was at Cisco and NetApp for several years, managing their engineering organizations. Pretty passionate about building strong engineering teams, minimizing the burnout. Definitely that is super critical because it's very easy to get burnout in terms of deliverables and dates. In my world, the definition of burnout is a little bit different. I feel that burnout is more of a mental state. And mostly people feel that they are burnout, but I feel people are cooked rather than being burnout. Because burnout is the extreme when people say like, okay, I'm done. It's hurting my physical strength. It's hurting my emotional strength. And I'm just done with it. So that's where, I differentiate between being cooked and being burnout.
That's great. Alan.
Hi, good morning or early afternoon for folks. My name's Alan. So my background, as Mustafa mentioned, so I was recently a senior director of engineering at a firm where I ran the finance engineering team. Other than a firm, I also have spent time in health tech with a startup called Council. I spent time with Square in its early days before it became a public company, at Google, and a couple of other small startups before that as well. So, good variety of experience across, companies and teams of different sizes. As for me, the way I think about burnout, or I guess there's two ways I think about it. One is basically the litmus test, which is do I want to get out of bed this morning and try to do stuff, right? Which is, a combination of motivation and sometimes, sadly, like being a little bit depressed about what's going on. And kind of working backwards from, if you think that you're going to hit that point at some point in the future, working backwards and then figuring out where you are now in terms of how far you're burnt out. The other way I look at it is thinking of kind of your energy levels, or the way how much motivation you have, how stressed and tired are you. The analogy I use is basically drawing water from a well. For folks in California, we've been in drought conditions for many years now. So the idea of, having a ground well, drawing water from it, for some folks, hopefully is familiar. And the idea is that if you draw from it, but you let it refill over time, it's a sustainable state, right? Where you have to draw too far all at once is actually when you realize actually, you're drawing so far in the point where it actually doesn't refill anymore and becomes this kind of empty well. That's kind of the feeling when you get, or at least that I think about when you kind of go into this burnout state. So of course, this session and this talk is really about avoiding getting to that scenario.
Great. Well, so I hear kind of senses from Monica mentioning a difference between being cooked and being actually burnt out, at that being that kind of more extreme emotional state. And then Alan, kind of that litmus test of, do I want to get out of bed in the morning? that's an interesting one, because I know that there's certain jobs where that has been true, maybe not necessarily because I'm feeling bad or negative about the problem that I have, but maybe more about like the boss that I have at the time or the people that I'm working with, et cetera, which, I mean, maybe a boss alone can burn somebody out. You know, it's not just about the work, right? Yeah. Fascinating. So I'm going to dive right into the Q&A that folks have posed. Feel free, folks, go and upvote these questions. You don't have to come up with questions yourselves, but please upvote them, because I'm going to generally go in order. So this one is from Eric Van Egmond. And by the way, feel free either of you to answer, and I'm sure this won't be like a presidential debate. Just interrupt as appropriate, and I'm sure everything will be fine. And I'll moderate as needed. How do you protect highly committed engineers from burning themselves out in an effort to meet the needs of a project when they intentionally would rather keep working through their fatigue?
Okay, I can take that. Basically, you need to always watch out for your high performers. That's the number one goal. And when I say high performers, not just from the delivery perspective, but also how they are doing. Across the board, as an engineering leader or as a people leader, you should be watching your entire team. More so when you see somebody is putting extra hours. What I have done is I regularly check on them, making sure they are doing good. And if there is anything which is too much on their plate, taking that proactive conversation from an engineering leader or from a people leader to their employees is always helpful. Because most of the times the employees, sometimes, they are not open about it, like how they are feeling. But if you take that step, it is really helpful for them to open up and help them out. And once you know the details, you need to help them out, either share that burden, because I strongly believe that it's not a top-down leadership. It's more around, we are peers, we are just in different roles. How can I help you as a team we succeed, or divvy up amongst other team members as well? So that's where we do. Also, not set up unrealistic timelines with the team. That's super critical. Take them into consideration when you set up some timeline with your execs and say like, okay, this will be done. Because everybody wants right now. And as a people leader, it's really important for you to make that commitment to your team as well.
I would add that, exactly what Monica said about making sure you do check in with your team. One thing I do as well is I try to teach people, like we actually talk about what the definition of burnout is, right? And try to tell people, hey, recognize when you yourself are starting to kind of get there. For me personally, particularly earlier in my career, I didn't recognize what burnout actually looked like. So you kind of fall into it and you didn't know that you were like, why am I not motivated? 6 months ago, I would have been super happy and super productive to do these things. Now I cannot anymore, right? And I say that because sometimes, different people do have different levels of tolerance for productivity, for, being able to do the work. And, you as a manager, even if you know them very well, some people turns out very good at hiding, whether they are there or not, right? So it's important to actually kind of let the people know. And I actually wish somebody told me that early in my career, because once you are able to recognize it yourself, then you're able to elevate and escalate to your manager when you start feeling that way, right? Both true for yourselves as managers, but also for your reports and for your ICs. Again, particularly for early, more entry level or junior engineers, they feel like they can just run all day, right? And teaching them kind of what it means, teaching them to kind of see the signs in themselves and being able to talk through it really kind of tries to catch it before it really gets out of hand, right? If somebody is kind of in that state where they are burned out, then unfortunately, at least in my experience, there's not much you can do other than just giving them that break, because by definition, or kind of they're in a state where they're not going to be productive, and kind of letting people know, hey, like once you kind of get there, then you're actually much less productive than you would be otherwise. It becomes a net negative. So, being able to talk through it, being able to kind of give people the definitions and be able to self-diagnose and self-recognize also becomes an important factor.
So I hear kind of two themes, one around essentially having emotional intelligence, for lack of a better word, to be able to like see what's going on with your team and to treat them more as a peer when it comes to that kind of like emotional relationship, right? So that you can have that connection to be able to talk at that level about something that is essentially an emotional experience. And then in addition, pattern matching and being able to actually particularly for earlier employees who haven't experienced this pattern, if they don't have the ability to match this pattern, like one of the opportunities you have as a leader is to say, well, this is a pattern that I've either experienced before or seen before. Let me share, what this pattern matching looks like. I reflect on, and this, I've mentioned this in Plano too, like many years of therapy has been very helpful for me as an engineering manager. And one of the things that I'm reminded of from my own experience there, as well as talking with folks on my teams, has been the people pleaser mentality that many folks have, particularly introverts can have it, many introverts, and there tend to be a lot of, engineering and introversion tend to correlate a little bit, and the interesting thing that happens with people pleasing, which is that, and non-confrontationalism, is that we don't want people to be angry, so we do what's necessary to people please, and sometimes we do that even when we don't feel good about it. Sometimes we'll go with a technical decision we disagree with without speaking up for our concerns and just do it. Sometimes there's a product direction where we're building the product and suddenly things go in this other way that we don't feel good about, and we stay silent, right? And all of these things add up to where, all of that people pleasing actually turns into hidden resentment, which then we don't reveal. And the resentment grows and grows and boils, and then that can lead, particularly if we never discuss it, to not wanting to wake up in the morning, right? We're just holding on to this anchor, and we don't want to have a conversation because we're non-confrontational, et cetera. So I very much value both the sort of the peer connection, that you mentioned, Monica, as well as that pattern matching and knowing what's going on, whether from yourself or somebody else. It's great. This next question from Tushar Dadlani: if you are burned out as a leader yourself, how do you stop that from impacting your team?
I can take a stab at this. So as I mentioned, right? So, step one, almost as a default, is again, like being able to recognize yourself, because it's the most important thing. I can tell all of you from experience that, you don't hide it as well as you think you do, and people won't know. And it's hard as much as you try, right? Again, like particularly if you're the leader that other people see, and they, see your behaviors, they study your behavior sometimes, right? Definitely, it's really hard to actually hide it, right? So, what I suggest is, being transparent, right? Again, like, and don't, try to hide it to the point where people are kind of wondering, well, what actually is happening, right? Behavior's off. Alan isn't his usual pepper self, and things like that, and kind of being transparent about it and letting the team know, and in some senses, providing people sometimes the opportunity for themselves to step up, and help you out, and giving them permission to do that, facilitate that conversation. I find that entrusting your team and your reports, and being forthright about it more often than not is a very powerful mechanism for folks to relay, and it also kind of gives you that base of support sometimes that you need yourself to kind of get out of it. So definitely I would advocate for transparency.
To add to what Alan says, I think being self-aware in every situation is really important, whether it is burnout or anything else which is happening within your teams. I heavily rely, the moment I feel, most of the times, people feel burnout is because they are taking everything on themselves, and they feel that they are the only ones who can do everything, and that is not right. So what you need to understand, like the projects which we are working, the programs at Workday right now, the way I did was like identify your subject matter experts in the team, divvy up the work, and definitely be a part of those teams. Do regular check-ins with those teams, like how they are doing, provide your input, share your input, learn from them, being more on the listening mode. It really helps a lot. And divide and conquer, because unless and until you make them feel that, hey, this is a team effort, you are accountable, you are empowered. Those two things are really important, because a lot of times people feel empowered, but then suddenly when the accountability comes, they are kind of shaking. So we want to make sure we support them during that time. And that is really helpful in order to avoid this overall team burnout and your own burnout.
I hear kind of two complementary things. One is to be transparent and to just be real about what's going on. And the other is, relying on your team and actually getting help from your team and identifying your SMEs. and I think what I intuit from that, from what you're mentioning, Monica, is, that you don't have to do it all yourself, right?
Yep.
That a lot of this, this question was posed kind of like, if I'm experiencing these symptoms, how do I deal with that with my team? And I think that kind of what you're alluding to is that, well, one thing you can do is address the symptoms by maybe reducing the ways in which you're burnt out by potentially relying on your team. We have, I'm sure, many folks who are listening right now who maybe are new managers, right? And I know for myself, like thinking about those early days, right? You kind of feel like you're in this new position and you want to show certainty and command authority and have people feel that they can, believe in you and rally behind you. And so sometimes you end up, sometimes that gets manifested into like micromanagement and kind of doing everything yourself and not really relying on those subject matter experts or 10x engineers or whatever, hype word we want to use, or just, everybody, right? I mean, that's what a team is for. So I appreciate the idea that you need to rely on your team and be open and transparent with your team. I imagine there may be some folks who might be concerned about being too transparent in that, you don't want to have your team kind of like lose faith in what's going on or get burnt out as well. So maybe this is just a follow-up question for myself. How can you both be transparent with your emotions and share openly what's going on for you, since they can see it anyway, most of the time, and still have the team like maintain the faith, if you will?
I want to go ahead.
No, go ahead, Alan. No worries. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, you're right. Like transparency, there's always a danger in kind of letting people know too much, right? And then they kind of get bummed out. And I will say that there is, I think that there is some strength in transparency and vulnerability as a way to kind of show people that you yourself, you're also human, right? And that being vulnerable itself, it's not necessarily a sign of weakness, but a sign that like you all want to work together. What I've employed over the years has been, yes, kind of recognizing the situation of what it is, right? And being transparent about what the state of the world is today for myself, and looking even at the question set, right? Like it's one thing we haven't not talked too much about is the external factors. Election coming in 2 weeks. COVID's been going on for the last, 7 or 8 months, right? People are cooped up either in their small apartments or like me, kids running around, right? Like there are, legitimately beyond the work-related burnout issues, like the world issues, right? That people can also be burned out by. And again, which is why, being vulnerable, being transparent and discussing it, to me, is such a powerful mechanism to kind of let all of that, come out, right? Even when sometimes you can't do too much about it because it is the rest of the world. And going back to the strategy that I then employ is really kind of, looking ahead to a better future. And kind of, again, acknowledging the past, what it is, acknowledging the state of the world, but then kind of talking through, okay, like where can we go, right? And being optimistic about it so that, again, hopefully you don't then also bum out your people along the way. But really kind of looking ahead to see, what can you change? If you can change, how can you be optimistic about what's going to happen? And kind of not, once you acknowledge that if the state of the world is in a crappy spot, fine, but not be satisfied with the crappy state of the world, right? Like what can we do either within ourselves that's within our control or actions that we can take that would materially change the state of the world, from a work-related standpoint or otherwise, and kind of move on from this area. So that's what I encourage people to do. That's why we kind of discuss it, because it does. If you're stuck in the interim and you recognize that the interim is sucky, then yeah, you're not going to go very far. You do have to make sure that there is an optimistic outlook, looking ahead, that kind of hopefully kind of gets you out of that quagmire.
Yeah, I mean, as an engineering leader, I have seen that from time to time, you have to show the big picture to the team and bring them back to a smaller, narrow, view as well. And during these times, having those discussions, like when you said about transparency, it can be multiple ways. Like, for example, if something is going on in my home, in my personal life, obviously I don't want to project it. I don't want to show like, hey, because of this, I'm, getting disturbed and, it's hurting the team. So you have to have a fine balance. But when you see your employees going through this, and I have had this experience in my teams, somebody who was really performing very high, and then suddenly you see that they are not performing. Rather than making any judgment, it is important to have that conversation with them and see how you can help them. And if it is in their personal life, obviously you can help only so much, but at least provide that space where people can thrive and people can come back, because I think those are really important. And during these times, as Alan mentioned, there are so many factors around you, which is adding. So simple things like, yes, on the positive note, we are having a quality family time, but pretty much I can tell you at my home, everybody is like robot in the morning. Like everybody moves into different rooms, comes have their breakfast, and then moves back. And then we meet in the evening for dinner. So actually, people, when they have little kids, it's really hard. Whatever quality time they have in the car, listening to the audiobooks, now it has turned into, spending time, and you can do only so much. So that is also adding indirect burnout, however much you want to spend time with your family, but this is definitely adding up as well.
Totally. And, I remember folks used to refer to me as chief therapy officer back in the day, because I mean, that's kind of, it doesn't have to be our jobs. And like, I know some folks on this call are like, that is so not my thing. Like, I want to manage people. I don't want to be a therapist. And at the same time, these are the real problems that are happening, particularly right now during the pandemic, right? You have, children, yourself, family, pets, whatever. I mean, there's chaos, and to ignore that or pretend that it doesn't exist is not really good for anyone. And at the same time, as Monica, you were alluding to, like, if somebody is having a personal issue, you can't also like pry deep into that without them actually being comfortable enough to reveal it themselves, right? So we're not quite like at therapist level, and yet if we know that folks might come to us in that way, and we're capable of handling that and having and holding space for them and listening to them, we might be able to somewhat serve some of the purpose of what a therapist might provide in terms of listening, care, feeling heard, etc. Alan, I really appreciate you mentioning vulnerability. I mean, vulnerability is in, Brene Brown, like it's a thing. Vulnerability is in for leaders. And the challenge, as Monica was alluding to, is it's like, yeah, you want to be vulnerable, but you don't want to like kind of be that like, I don't know, like the parents that you see on Judge Judy or something, just like all over the place and chaotic. And, you got to be a little responsible and still kind of command authority, but show that care. And vulnerability is a way of doing that. I recall at one job, kind of the allying via the common enemy that's burning us both out, right? Maybe you have like a really annoying, rude leader at the top, and like that's something to bond over. That's of course a very treacherous territory, because you also want to make sure that folks are believing in what the company is doing moving forward. But I know in desperate times, sometimes, using that sort of the enemy of my enemy is my friend kind of thing can sometimes help people get motivated, because some people are motivated by fear, anger, some people are motivated by praise, different for everyone. Another question from Eric again. What are your favorite strategies for supporting your team through our current external environment stressors, especially while we're unable to be together in person?
Sure. I mean, I can take that question. I can share what I have been doing. One is make sure you have boundaries between your work life and personal life. And I'm not going to call it as a work-life balance, to be honest. Like, this is more around, there is no balance right now. You just have to figure out what works the best for you. And it's not about the number of hours. A lot of times people, relate that if I'm working for long hours, it becomes a burnout. And I don't think so. I work for long hours, but if you're passionate about it, it doesn't feel like burnout, and you will still have your priorities in place. You will balance everything. So keep that in mind. Like, do not relate that math of long hours working versus, a burnout. It can be if you don't enjoy. So definitely keep the boundaries. I always feel that, you have to prioritize your family first, irrespective of where you are working. Because keep one thing in mind, jobs come and go, but family once goes, it never comes back, or it's hard to, put it back. So keep that in mind, and, turn off, you have to take those rigid stake, like, okay, I'm not going to have my cell phone near me on the dinner table, like little things, because kids watch you. And I have been notified a few times, so I'm being very mindful about, like, do not have the phone. It's not urgent. Life is not going to end here. Let's me just have a quality time. So whatever time you spend with your people, whether it is at work or whether it is at home, it has to be a quality time. And I always encourage, so for example, we talked about new hires or new people managers. When they join your team, as a leader, you need to be more, engaged, more proactive around telling them, like, how the culture of the team is. And you definitely set that first precedence around, like, hey, this is the way we work. So at least they feel comfortable, like, okay, my manager feels that way. So I need to do not overdo, like, or do not go to the extremes. Coming from you is really helpful. That's the way I look at it.
Cool. I would add, I guess, a couple of more tactical things, some of which I've stolen from my managers because they do a better job at this than I do. One is consider setting up care packages to your team, like so small care packages. This is a reminder, again, like you don't have the direct human connection anymore, but you can still remind them that, it's still a team, you still care about each other. And a lot of times I find that people really do appreciate it, like even with something really small. And another idea is to schedule direct time, sometimes lunches or snack time. We had tea time at one point with a team of mine, or like game time and things like that. And then, it's still, again, not the same as, being able to hang out in person, but it is an opportunity to still socialize outside of a direct, what are you working on setting. Definitely encourage people to, go out. One, it stops you from working. But secondly, sunlight's good for you. At least if you have sun available, just go over the weekend, go walk around, go do something other than being cooped up in your house. Be responsible. But definitely encourage people to get outside a little bit more. It's just general health best practice. And yeah, as mentioned, being able to kind of talk through, again, like there's stuff that's work related, and then there's a bunch of stuff that are stressors that are not work related. From experience, I definitely know that, like, when you feel like your manager isn't really recognizing the situation that you're in, and things like, again, like you have a lot of kids running around the house, or you're stuck in a small apartment with 2 roommates and all of you are Zoom calls, and so you're just yelling over each other, situations like that, right? And kind of being able to talk through it, to me, is a really powerful signal to send to your report, again, if nothing else, so that they know that somebody else empathizes with what it is that they're going through. So some of the kind of tactical things that you can do to try to help your people through this time.
This wisdom for both of you is so great. The boundaries concepts, it's like relates to what I was saying earlier about kind of being a people pleaser, right? Like, and being an introvert and trying to avoid confrontation. Confrontation avoidance is like huge Venn diagram overlap with not having boundaries, right? You need to be able to create boundaries, to be able to engage in challenging conversations, to be able to push back, to be able to, take the time and space that you need for self-care, for caring for your family, etc. I value and appreciate what you mentioned, Monica, about family, right? We need to keep in perspective, particularly today, how many months, days, weeks, or years are we spending at a given job these days, compared to our predecessors, like folks tend to job switch quite a bit. And the care packages thing, I think, is fascinating. And it reminds me of actually the 5 love languages, for those who may be familiar with this concept. There's a book about it. And these days, a lot of like personal books I find tend to relate quite a lot to work. This is one that I'm reminded of, in that, like, you might hear care packages, go, oh, that's dumb, right? Well, how would you feel if instead it was like somebody just telling you how amazing your work was and how wonderful, something was, or someone planting a tree in your honor, right? So, they talk about these love languages: words of affirmation, acts of service, receiving gifts, quality time, and not so great at work, but physical touch. Maybe in certain situations, but those kind of 5 examples of how you can like show care or love for your team members, not everybody resonates with one of those 5 things quite the same way, but some people are really, really easily motivated by just one of them. I find for myself, like just simple praise, right? As long as I believe it, even if it's BS, like that can motivate me quite a bit. I also appreciate, Monica, what you're mentioning about, it's not necessarily about the hours worked, right? That you can spend like 8, 10, 12, 15 hours on something and feel energized throughout the whole thing because you're really in the zone, so to speak. You're in flow, as they talk about in positive psychology. But if you're in a space or a place where you're doing work that you've just been trying to dread or been avoiding over and over again, in my case, it's like writing end-to-end tests that I don't want to write. It's like every like thought about having to go back and do it is just like, burns me out thinking about it, and there are other people who it's like the opposite. They're like, oh my gosh, that sounds so fun. I don't want to do these other things. So, I appreciate, the idea that we need to show love for our team in some way through some kind of love language, if you will, maybe a care package. And we also need to create boundaries for ourselves because ultimately that helps to prevent that burnout. So I love this.
To add to that, David, the energy part, I really feel that if you are energized in one thing which you do, that energy actually doubles, triples when you do something else. So, think about it, like if you are doing something which you are really passionate, whether it's with your family or work, you are basically transmitting that powerful, positive energy across.
Totally. I love it. So let's see, this next question, I want to say that we've answered this. With less separation between home and work and much less direct contact with reports, how do you enable team leaders to be able to identify and prevent team members from burning themselves out? I don't know if there's anything else y'all want to add.
The only thing I would add to that is make sure that you yourself have set those boundaries clearly and make sure that you're not kind of setting implicit expectations on your folks that they have to be, say, available hours of the day, right? Like it is something as simple as schedule your emails to go out the next morning instead of midnight. If you're the one having to work, then I guess you have a bunch of kids, right? It's simple things like that, right? Where, by being explicit about the boundaries you're setting for yourself, you hopefully also have that standard be percolated downwards, and so that your leads and your reports basically and your team knows the same thing. They're hopefully not taking cues from you if you're having to work weird hours, if you're struggling to keep those boundaries yourself. So you have to fix yourself first.
Yes, and a couple of things we have done is like Wednesdays, and of course Workday does support, but if you want to do it for your team, pick a day in the week where you say like, no meeting day. That itself is so relaxing for people to just rejuvenate and focus on their work, whatever is pending. And as Alan pointed out, and I'm really working on it, like not sending any emails, but again, the protocol has been like, if it is urgent, I'm going to mark it urgent. Otherwise it can wait, because as a leader, you want to finish all your work before it piles up next day. So you have only that time during the day when you want to focus on everything else. So definitely that is important.
I appreciate that. And being explicit is a theme I've heard a little bit. Monica, you alluded earlier to being explicit about your boundaries. Alan, you're mentioning, you both have kind of actually alluded to that. And then being explicit about culture as well, and like the culture that you're trying to create. So I think it's a good call out that just hoping that boundaries exist by setting an example, or hoping that your culture will be a certain way. If you just set an example, it doesn't always work. Sometimes you need to do those explicit steps, whether that be defining no meeting Tuesday or no meeting Thursday, or push back when somebody scheduled something that didn't seem urgent on that no meeting day, right? Or as Alan was kind of really hammering in that point of defining your boundaries as well. So that's great. All right, so let's see, we have Ryan. Do you think team size, number of people they directly manage, has any effect on burnout rates of a leader? If so, what would you consider a healthy team size for a leader?
As an engineering leader, if we don't think about what program you're working on or what initiative you're working on, pretty much like I would say like 8 people under a first line manager is still a good size. The key thing is you need to be able to understand whether you are able to give your one-on-one times with people. I have a situation right now where I'm looking for a senior manager under me, and I'm filling in my role and the senior manager. And I can tell you, it is not fun, because you're not able to dedicate like one-on-ones with all like 20 people under you sometimes. And you have to pick and choose sporadically, like, how things are, but still keep a pulse, check on the entire team. So 8 is a good size. However, if you are working on a program or an initiative which is very much visible, you should definitely go to your leaders and ask for more headcounts, and definitely, structure the org in a different way. So that's super critical.
Yeah, I would concur. I would say, if you were to put a number on it, 6 to 8 reports for a line manager, and if you're managing managers, I would say 4 to 6.
Yeah.
Managers. It's a pretty full load in terms of being able to manage a team. And I would also add that, if you are starting to feel burnout, right, chances are what the underlying factor why you are burning out is basically you haven't developed the strategies for managing such a team, and you're using whatever strategies that you were using previously. And I see this most common when a manager is transitioning to a manager of managers, where you don't have as many direct reports. Maybe you have 3 managers reporting under you, but then each of them have like 8 reports, right? So really your team is within 25 to 30 people. But then if you're using the same strategy as you were a line manager, then it almost feels like you're managing 30 people directly, and then of course you're going to get burned out. So I would suggest at least reflect on, there are different management techniques and styles and strategies to deal with certain sizes. And if you feel like you're starting to burn out, chances are, basically it's an indicator that you should start looking at what that next level strategy is going to be for yourself, and kind of picking up that skill set. And hopefully that helps you alleviate some of that stress and that feeling of just being overwhelmed, just the team's getting too big.
I hear from both of you, that this 6 to 8, et cetera, that's definitely kind of that range that I've heard of. I'm always reminded of kind of, I learned in like Psychology 101, we talk about 7 plus or minus 2 is the number of individual items we can keep in our memory, all together before we like start forgetting. And I think about, in human-computer interaction, 5 plus or minus 2, give or take, about like the number of links to have side by side before the user experience starts to get wonky and people start to slow down when they're looking at things. But the point is that it's enough to like keep in your head, right? That you can keep all these folks in your head so that you can, as you mentioned, Monica, schedule one-on-ones as necessary, which is really, really important, right? Like I've definitely been on mentorship calls where people have mentioned their team size of 15 and like maybe alluding to pride because they're capable of it. And it's like, okay, well, we all pride ourselves in different things. Some people use their paycheck as like a badge of honor. I would say that, happiness would be my pinnacle thing. And having 15 folks, I mean, somebody is probably going to be really unhappy in that equation, right? Or if not yourself, then probably the folks on your team. So if you folks that are listening are not in that general like 6 to 8, give or take kind of range, it's worth reflecting. Are you able to give that one-on-one attention to folks as needed? The other thing that I'm reminded of too is kind of the quality versus quantity thing, right? That like all it takes is like one really frustratingly, annoyingly, whatever, just not great employee in whatever realm, right? Maybe like somebody that's causing a lot of drama, or like somebody that's really toxic. Like all it takes is one of those to make you feel like you got way too much on your hands. Does that resonate with both of you?
Yeah,
it does.
All right. Next question here. So we have from Naveen, would love to hear if anyone has cut goals because teams are getting burned out instead of trying to help individuals. Alternatively, have you hired, say, 20% more to account for the impact of this new normal?
Definitely. The goals are like, the live document. So when you commit to something, like, for example, if you set OKRs for every quarter, we set the OKRs. We constantly pivot our OKRs based on if new commitments have come, or if somebody in the team is, the team size has shrunk, or there are other things which the team thought like they will be able to finish in a certain time, but they are not able to do it. So definitely, acknowledging that something is happening within the team is super critical. Because if you ignore it and say, hey, this is the way we embarked on this journey, these are 10 things we have to do, and no matter what happens, we have to do it, I think we are not giving the right message. Because when we sign up for certain commitments, we are still signing up with some unknowns. And as those unknowns become known entities, we should definitely make a call and be transparent about it. Like, hey, we don't know everything. We will continue to refine these items as we learn more and prioritize them, so that when you sign up for 10 things, you definitely have a priority in place. So if push comes to shove and like we have to draw a line, exactly where things are going to go away. So it's pretty much same thing as like the product prioritization you do. And the second question was, alternatively, have you hired say 20% more? So one thing to remember is, I hear that very much, like, oh, throw in more people, things are going to get solved. In my opinion, that's not always the best strategy. You really need to think about whether it is the manpower issue, whether it is strategic, because sometimes it can create more chaos than, working with a smaller team sometimes is much better than working with 15, 20, 30 people, thinking that the work will get resolved. So I would be very mindful based on, what the situation is.
That's right. So I'm going to remind a little bit, say back in the March, April timeframe, right? When basically, the entirety of the United States kind of went into heightened alert mode for COVID. And at that time, there was basically, for a lot of companies, a lot of teams, there was actually no choice. Basically, you remember a bunch of companies actually laid people off, which means that everybody else got dealt with more work. And since you laid people off, there was no hiring to be done, right? Like these are parameters outside of your control, and sometimes, companies also had to pivot their strategies and pivot their product line, pivot their roadmaps. Again, when COVID hit, it was a world-changing event, right? And I'm reminded of that because, again, like these factors sometimes are out of your control, where it's really difficult, right, for you to be able to either commit to less because, well, what your team, so for example, my team at a firm, finance engineering team, pretty core to the pivot that we actually had to make as a company to the overall systems in order to handle kind of a new world with COVID, and so that's going to sometimes that's just really not in your control, and so I wouldn't necessarily rely on the opportunity to hire more people or to ask people to do less. So I go back to this idea of the analogy of basically drawing water from a well, right? Because hopefully before all this stuff hit, you have built up enough reserves, so that you can go, hey, there'll be times when we're going to have to push hard, and hopefully we have built up enough kind of energy reserves for people to really sprint towards this thing. Again, it is going to be tough sometimes. You have no choice. And hopefully, what you can do is once that kind of period of, call it crunch, sprinting, that hectic period is over, then you kind of give people that leeway. And again, it depends almost on a per team basis, and sometimes even on a per individual basis as to, whether how people kind of respond to that level of intensity or that or those stressors. Give an example, I had an engineer who not only did they get a not good performance review, but they were also working from home, and they were asked to do a lot during, I think it was Q2. And they actually responded really well to that. They were so pissed off that, there were all these things wrong with the world. My boss thinks I could do better. I'm going to show them exactly what I'm made of. And they actually did really, really well, right? There are times when people actually respond really well to that. And then there are other times I had another engineer who, was doing pretty well. And then they were stuck at home, small apartment, and, just the performance degraded over time. You could very much tell that they were kind of going down that path. And so I said all this to kind of note that, you can definitely do it at a team level. But I wouldn't say it's not a rule that can be universally applied, and it is very situational. Recognize, how your folks are responding. Also recognize the situation of, your team, your projects, your business, in order to, be able to see whether it makes sense or not.
I love it. Both of you have I think, in different ways alluded to the idea that hiring is probably not going to be an effective solution to this kind of problem when you're in the heat of the moment. I'm of course reminded of the the mythical man month kind of thing that you can't have a baby with 9 women in 1 month, like you can't like just throw people at a problem and like hope that it's gonna solve itself. Particularly like if you've already set these OKRs, you're probably pretty late in the game, right? So like the ramp up alone for hiring, you need to, Alan, as you were alluding to with kind of like fill in the well, like you gotta like plan ahead a little bit. You gotta like, have some reserves to draw from. The other thing I appreciate from both of you is that particularly new managers, but also folks that tend to really draw a hard emotional boundary when it comes to work, let's say, in other words, don't make really much of an emotional connection with their team, can sometimes see their teams as numbers and see their goals as numbers and see everything as a math problem. And I think what you're both alluding to is that it's more complicated than that when it comes to people, because as you were talking about, Alan, like you can have somebody be actually really motivated by, fear of punishment, whatever, or like an inspiring story or an inspiring direction. I think I mentioned this in past talks, but I am always inspired when I hear folks talk about like kind of work-life balance and everything else that, Henry Ford in the Industrial Revolution, when he introduced this concept of the 5-day work week, suddenly productivity went up dramatically. And this is where like the math that you would think of like X hours produces Y output doesn't work out that way. But similarly, you can find somebody who like was actually not productive and totally burnt out, who when put as like the main person responsible for something big, something major, they get this sense of meaning and purpose that can fuel them through an otherwise trying time. I've found this like with one of the hardest burnouts that can occur is when you have tragedy in your family, you have a close loved one pass away, and how do you manage through that? And everyone has different strategies, but also everybody mourns in a very different way. And there are people for whom giving them a sense of direction at work and meaning and purpose at work, to do something at work, can actually be helpful for them. And you may find this surprising productivity that can come from that. So we have just a few more minutes, just like 3 more minutes really. So I'm just gonna ask one more question and then we'll do a little bit of a wrap up. So this one, let's see, from somebody new, Jason Liu, how do you differentiate between burnout and poor performance for someone whom you haven't managed for that long?
So the best way I would do is, if someone is in this situation, first and foremost, you need to talk to them, listen to them, like what's going on, what is causing this? Because obviously, you hired them or you inherited them, whatever the situation is. Do talk to them. How you can help them, and then based on the data they provide you, you can figure out like, is it they are. I mean, at some point in time, as a people leader, how much work that individual can handle based on their roles. So, for example, if somebody has just joined and is like a senior software engineer or a senior manager, there are certain expectations of the role, and initially the person needs some ramp up time, but at some point in time they have to start delivering. So there is certain expectation tied with the role. And if that is not happening, talk to them and understand like where they are stuck. Because I'll tell you, like in my experience, the fact that you are not being told as a leader, but you are taking the first step to know them better and understand where there are challenges and then maneuver them through. Sometimes coaching is required. That, hey, these are 10 things, as David pointed out, as a new person, you want to crank everything and say like, okay, I'm going to do everything, but actually that's not. The way I tell them is like, okay, take your time. First 30 days, you need to warm up yourself and understand like, how the ecosystem works. And based on that, you decide. So definitely, that's the difference between burnout and poor performance. You can definitely help them bring back on track.
I mean, I would add, maybe on a more pragmatic level, if you haven't been managing somebody too long, I don't think the difference between how you would handle a poor performer and somebody who's burnt out is actually all that different, right? Because at the end of the day, you're going to talk to them, you're going to ask, hey, how do I get you out of this? And they're going to tell you something and you're going to try to do it. And it's either going to work or not work, right? And, assume, worst case scenario, it doesn't work out, then, well, they're either still burnt out or really they're misleveled or they can't handle it or some other reason, right, kind of has gone wrong. But again, on a pragmatic and practical level, I think the results, the outcome would actually be similar, right? And sometimes you really cannot keep somebody in that role, maybe again, not poor performance, but really burned out. If they can't get out of their burned out again, I think the result ends up being very similar. Of course, you want to be empathetic to somebody who is in that state, right, and kind of give them some leeway. At the same time, I would argue that it's not, again, like it practically ends up being kind of the same path, and maybe the differentiation there isn't as important, at least in terms of the actions that you would take.
I love it. Well, with that, we've hit our time. I want to thank you so much, Monica and Alan, for sharing your wisdom. This has been a really valuable, actually, set of lessons for myself. I hope that those who are listening also received value. Again, we're Plato. If you're interested in having mentorship either for yourself or folks on your team at your organization, feel free to connect. We, love being mentors and love having a purpose through that. So, Monica and Alan, thank you so much, and I hope you all have a wonderful.
Thank you all.
Year.
Thank you very much.
Enjoy the rest of your days. Thank you.
You too.
Bye.
Bye-bye.